morning. Good to see so many familiar and new faces. I'm Linda Orsoletto. I'm your City Club Board President. Welcome. Thank you again for coming. So we have sponsors that I would like to thank who really help us out financially. We could not do it without you. And so we're listing our gold sponsors, and our full list of sponsors, silver sponsors, and bronze are on our website. So today our sponsors are ASI Wealth Management, the City of Bend, Central Oregon Community College, OSU Cascades, St. Charles, Pacific Source, Central Oregon Association of Realtors, and Brooks Resources. So I also want to thank our sponsors for today. They are the National Association of Realtors, Loan Depot, and you see the information on your table. Energy Trust New Building Program, the Central Oregon Association of Realtors, and the City of Bend. Now, if you'd like to see or hear your name recognized here as a sponsor, talk to Kim or any of the board members if you'd like to be a sponsor. So last month we had our membership drive. So thank you to everybody who joined in May. Would you be willing to raise your hand just so we could recognize and thank you? Yay, I see some people. Thank you so much. And what about our current members? Raise your hand. That's so good to see. Thank you so very much. And if membership is something that you would like to do, you can check out our website or talk with any of our board members. If our board members would raise your hands. There you go. Thank you. And also just following up on our membership drive, for our new member, for a person who received the case of wine that was donated by Va Piano Winery, it was Holly Serini, who is the development director of Cascades Academy. I also want to shout out to Luca Pozzi, who referred a lot of new members, and to Kathy Bosco for spearheading our membership drive. Thank you for that. So on to the reason we are here. So moderating today's forum is Brenna Visser. She is the communications coordinator for the City of Bend's and Economic Development Department. And you may recognize her. She was at the Bulletin at one time. She is a native of Wenatchee, Washington. And she has called Bend home for the last 4 years. When she's not at work, you can find her, like many people, skiing at Mount Bachelor or walking along the river with her wife and dog, Gaia. Welcome, Brenna, to the stage.
Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for the warm introduction. We're going to begin today with a keynote speaker, followed by a panel discussion and audience Q&A. Our keynote speaker this morning is Bill Fulton, one of the nation's leading thinkers on urban planning and land use. He currently serves as a senior advisor to PFM Management and Budget Consulting Group and a visiting policy designer at the University of California, San Diego. Bill's first career was a journalist. We got that in common, I guess. Specializing in writing about cities and urban issues. He has also been the head of a land use think tank, a principal in a land use consulting firm, and vice president for policy and implementation at the advocacy group, Smart Growth America, based in Washington, D.C. His work has focused heavily on how land use policy drives real-world urban planning outcomes. He is the author of Guide to California Planning, the standard land use planning textbook in California, which is now in its 6th edition. His 8th book, Place and Prosperity, How Cities Help Us Connect and Innovate, was published by Island Press last year. And so just to give an overview of the timeline, basically we'll spend about a half hour on the keynote. There'll be a half hour of panel discussion and about a half hour of Q&A from y'all. So please welcome our keynote, Bill Fulton.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be in Bend. My daughter and her family live here. My daughter runs an acupuncture clinic called Aquaterra Health if you've ever heard of that, which is really a wonderful experience. I want to thank the City Club for having me here today. I want to thank especially my old friend Amy Sabadini for reconnecting with me and getting me here. I also want to apologize for overdressing. I realized this morning I was going to be overdressed. There's two reasons. One is when they ask you to fly in from out of town and be the keynote speaker, you kind of want to look the part, right? That's one. The other is I just moved back to San Diego. I spent the last 8.5 years living in a humid part of Texas, and I misplaced my sleeveless vest. So I don't have it anymore, and I haven't gotten another one yet. Thanks very much. I have spent most of my career studying land use issues all over the country and trying to understand whether land use laws and policies actually yield the outcomes they're supposed to yield or not. So with that in mind, it's a thrill to be here to talk about the 50th anniversary of the Oregon Land Use Act and give you a little perspective and background on where it came from and what the context was at the time and how that has changed. This should move forward, right? I'm going to keep pushing things till something works. Is this on? That's a good question. I don't know. While I'm figuring this out, maybe somebody can help me figure this out. I think it's an important point to make that there we go. Many of you, particularly those who've been around for a long time, remember the context for the land use law in 1973. It was promoted very strongly by Governor Tom McCall. It was his highest priority. And Tom McCall had a way with words. He was a television anchor guy before he went into politics, so he understood how to use words. And the most famous words he ever uttered, other than going on CBS News and saying, please visit us in Oregon, but please don't move here, was his famous speech to the legislature in 1973 when he was promoting the passage of SB 100, the land use law that led to that created the urban growth boundaries, where he said the interests of Oregon for today and the future must be protected from, and this is his most famous phrase ever, the grasping wastrels of the land. And unlimited and unregulated growth leads inexorably to a lower quality of life. So that was the context, the political context in which SB 100 was passed. But there was a broader context as well, if I can figure out. I guess I'm probably pushing toward the wrong thing here. I don't know quite what to, but the broader context was the environmental awakening of the late 60s, which many of you probably remember. Does anybody know where I'm supposed to be pushing this toward? I'm a little, there we go. So I guess I have to do it down there. In the late 60s, for those who, and many of you in the room I can see are old enough to remember this era, there was a sudden awakening of environmental consciousness in the United States. Two major events occurred in 1969 that led to this awakening. One was the fact that the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught fire, literally caught fire, which is what this is a picture of. And the other was an oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara, California. Both of those things occurred in 1969, and they led to great an awakening of the environmental consciousness, even to the point of even Sports Illustrated couldn't ignore it. Now, I was an avid reader of Sports Illustrated in 1970, and I just couldn't believe it when this was the cover of Sports Illustrated. This was before the swimsuit issues and so forth. But this was the cover of Sports Illustrated in 1970. That is how deeply embedded in our society this newly understood environmental consciousness actually became, that even Sports Illustrated couldn't ignore it. And then the National Environmental Policy Act was signed into law by the greatest environmental president in our history, Richard Nixon, who signed literally every important environmental law ever passed in the United States. The National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act. He signed them all because he wanted other things from a Democratic Congress. It wasn't because he was a great environmentalist. So in 1970, federal environmental law took off. But that wasn't the end of it. Interestingly enough, there was, in the subsequent couple of years, there was a very significant shift in the way people thought about land use for the first time ever. People hadn't given much thought to land use before the early 70s. Sprawl was rampant. There were a few pockets of resistance, particularly in California, but there hadn't been much thought to it. And then in 1973, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund came out with this document, The Use of Land, which was a call to action about land use. And it said, there is a new mood in America which is questioning the pace and direction of continued urban development patterns. And interestingly enough, this was not only Democrats who signed on to this. Many moderate Republicans, and you may remember that Tom McCall was a moderate Republican, many moderate Republicans signed on to this general philosophy. The Use of Land was written by a guy named Bill Riley, who later became Bush 1's EPA administrator and was a moderate Republican his whole life. And Oregon was not alone in taking on land use as a major state issue. Oregon was not alone. Most states in around 1973 were trying to deal with the urban sprawl question and the land use question, as you can see by this excerpt from the New York Times in 1973. Public control of land use, et cetera. So state after state adopted land use laws of some kind or other. Florida had a law, which was eventually repealed by Republicans about 6 or 7 years ago, which was based on what they called concurrency, which was that infrastructure had to be in place around the way before new development could be built. As I say up there, this led to a fight between the state and the locals over who was supposed to pay for the infrastructure, right? Not surprisingly. The state of Washington also passed the Growth Management Act that some of you may be familiar with. It is not as top down. It is not as regulatory as Oregon. It is more advisory, but particularly in the Puget Sound region, you can see it led to a strategy of trying to push new development around the I-5 corridor and around the rail line that parallels the I-5 corridor in the Puget Sound region. In Maryland, the state designated growth areas and preservation areas and put all of its money for preservation in the preservation areas and all of its money for infrastructure into the growth areas. They didn't try to regulate anything from the state level. They just used the state budget as a mechanism. And in California, we tried everything. We tried everything. We tried urban growth boundaries. We tried our own version of concurrency. The state bought an enormous amount of land that essentially created urban growth boundaries in certain locations. We've tried aggressive transit-oriented development. There's also the California version of what I'll talk about later, the Oregon housing needs analysis called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment in California. In California, we tried everything. We tried it mostly at the local level. It was uncoordinated. It was kind of a big mess. But California is kind of a big mess, right? It just is. But that wasn't for lack of trying. And as I'll get back to a little later, there's no lack of policy in California about this stuff. There is a lack of coordination and understanding of how things fit together, which I think is emerging in Oregon as well. And in Oregon, you had the strongest law. What was true about Oregon was you had the strongest law in the country. It was top down. It was run by DLCD. It was more regulatory oriented. And as I'll get back to, there were lots of goals, 19 different goals. So McCall pushed this thing through in 1973, largely through the force of his own personality, over a lot of objections. And Oregon, it was not unusual what Oregon was trying to do in 1973, as I've shown. But Oregon did have a unique approach, which has had effects, both good and bad, for the last 50 years. So Now, as a result, densities did go up. I'm sorry that I am an urban planner and I like to show charts. I like to show charts and maps. I'm sorry about that. Maps are more interesting than charts, I realize. This was a study done by my friend Rebecca Lewis at the University of Oregon. She's one of the leading land use researchers in the country. And she did a study showing what the number of parcels per acre were before and after 1996 not in Portland, but in the other big counties. And you can see Deschutes on the left, where density went up in Deschutes faster than in any of the other counties, not counting Metro Portland. Partly because Bend and Deschutes was pretty rural and pretty unpopulated at the beginning, and so this went up a lot. But things have changed in the last 50 years in pretty dramatic ways. I just realized I can look over there. The population has grown rapidly in Oregon, and in Central Oregon, as you know. Basically, the city of Bend population has grown 1,000% in the last 50 years, from 10,000 to 100,000. Deschutes has gone up from 30,000 to 200,000. Now, population growth is flat at the moment. That's partly demographics nationally, where there's less immigration from other countries and there's fewer babies being born. Why fewer babies were born during COVID, I don't understand. But and it's partly because of home price. Home prices have gone up so much that it is hard for people to move in. So the question of whether or not population is going to stay flat forever, I think, is an open question. I think probably not. I think the flow from California is probably not going to stop, because as expensive as Bend and Deschutes is, it's still affordable to somebody who has a lot of home equity from California, right? And it's an attractive alternative, particularly to the Bay Area. Housing production has been down persistently during the last 30 years. I don't really have data for the last 50 years, but I have a lot of data for the last 30 years. And you can see, particularly since the Great Recession, housing production has never returned to what it was before. Housing production has never returned to what it was before. And all of those bars are still lower than housing production was prior to the passage of SB 100 in 1973. Population growth and housing production, population growth has gone up faster than housing production for 30 years. You saw that in the 90s, you saw it again in the 2010s. That is not unusual for the Western United States, but it is a factor. And of course, and this is Oregon, the price of housing has gone through the roof, as you all know. To put that in perspective, and here of all the charts I'm going to show you, here's the one I want you to pay attention to. The green in this chart is median home price. The green is median household income for the whole state of Oregon. The yellow is the median home price. In 1990, it was about 2.5 to 1. Now it's now it's 5 or 6 to 1. You wonder why people can't afford to live in Oregon. This is why. So, whether or not you think SB 100 had anything to do with this, and there's people on both sides of that issue, this is the reality today. And this is a reality that did not exist 50 years ago when housing was affordable, in part because we were sprawling all over the place. So what would Tom do today? Would Tom go on CBS News or CNN or Fox News and say, visit Oregon, but please don't stay? Well, in that famous speech in 1973 before the legislature, Tom McCall not only talked about the grasping wastrels of the land, which is what everybody remembered, he said something else. He said, meaning quality of life. He said, true quality is absent if we allow social suffering to abide in an otherwise pristine environment. True quality of life is absent if we allow social suffering to abide in an otherwise pristine environment. So I think if Tom McCall were with us today, he would understand not only that the SB 100 had protected farm and forest land pretty well, but also that a series of circumstances had led to an affordable housing crisis that must be addressed one way or another. So maybe some rethinking is in order. Now, there are many reasons for the current situation. It's not just the supply of buildable land, and particularly the supplies of development-ready land. There are many reasons. These are reasons that are not, the other reasons are not unique to Oregon. The nature of households has changed. There are far more 1- and 2-person households than there were before. The demand for single-family homes on large lots has largely evaporated throughout the United States. Construction materials and labor supply are huge issues. And then, of course, planning processes that we all live with every day. But how nimble now that Oregon and Central Oregon in particular face this new challenge of affordable housing, how nimble is this land use system? How nimble is it? Now, on top of SB 100, you've got the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, and you've got the climate-friendly and equitable communities, which, by the way, was invented out of the gubernatorial administration and was not created by state law. So let me tell you a little bit of a lesson from California about all this. And I struggled mightily with how much to talk about California in this speech. And I'd finally decided, well, if I can come up with a bad example from California, that's probably okay. Right? So California has, when it comes to land use, California has no end of plans and policies and regulations. There are local general plan requirements. There's a state mandate to reduce vehicle miles traveled, to reduce driving in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Think about that. A state mandate to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a certain amount, which even with electric vehicles, given the slow fleet mix change, is going to mean changes in land use. There are huge endangered species issues in California, which have led to habitat conservation, which has essentially created urban growth boundaries around, particularly in Southern California. There is this complicated regional housing needs assessment process, which I'm happy to talk about more if you want. I'm hesitant to go into it because it's so complicated. And there is, as you can see on the right, our unique California Environmental Quality Act, which essentially requires environmental review of every development project, and leads to a lot of litigation over that, where neighborhood NIMBY groups sue to stop housing projects, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing is, all of these things have been piled on top of one another. So, as I always say, when California tries to reform its land use system, simplifying the system makes it more complicated. So, for example, under the California Environmental Quality Act, there is an exemption for infill development, but there are exceptions to the exemption. And there's endless litigation as to what is an exception to the exemption for infill development. It just gets incredibly complicated because all these things are piled on top of one another. And what that does is it creates a kind of a Rubik's Cube, like, okay, we want a lot of housing. We want to increase housing production. The governor of California is in favor of that. We want more affordable housing, but we want it near transit. We don't want to sprawl. We want to reduce driving to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But then we have to have good transit that people are actually going to ride. And it's like this incredible Rubik's Cube. In theory, it all fits together, right? In theory, it all fits together. But as I say, attempts to simplify the situation get really complicated. And of course, that favors the status quo. The more complicated the system is, the more it favors the status quo. So what do? Well, for one thing, you have a land use law that has 19 goals. So basically wants to solve every problem in the world, right? That's a lot of goals. And but I will say over the last 50 years, the one that has been more important than any other is protecting farm and forest land, which Oregon has done well, right? But there are 19 different goals in the law. So maybe you need to think about doing things differently. Maybe, and I'm speaking about Oregon as a whole now, I'll come back to Central Oregon in a minute. Maybe you need to think about what are a few really important goals? And how do you really simplify the system rather than making it more complicated? How can you lay a housing production requirement on top of SB 100 and make that simpler rather than more complicated? Because we've seen that get really complicated, that exact thing get really complicated in California. And is it possible to create simpler and more elegant coordination between land use and housing laws? How do you get there? Well, I would say understand two things about Oregon. One is your land use system is unique, but your problems, especially your affordable housing problems, are not. And so I think there's a lot to learn from other states. Sometimes I think in Oregon, based on what I am aware of, everybody tends to think of Oregon in land use as a world unto itself. We have an unusual, unique system, so therefore we must be unusual and unique. We're on our own planet and we can't learn from anybody else. I think that's not true. I think you can learn both good and bad from everybody else. And as I say, I think there's a lot of bad lessons from California that you can learn. This making things more complicated is a problem. Many people find comfort in it because they want the status quo to remain, right? They want the status quo to remain, but that doesn't solve the problem. It also doesn't keep things the same, right? It simply changes things in a different way. If you suppress housing production, you might think that you are keeping things the way they are, but of course, what will inevitably happen is housing prices will go up. So things aren't the same as they used to be, no matter what. You don't want to price out Oregon for Oregonians and not for Californians, which is essentially what's happening right now. And Tom McCall was very bold in a response to the pressing problem of the day. Maybe Oregon needs to be now. What about Central Oregon? Well, you can't control what goes on in Salem, and Bend and Deschutes are already, I think, ahead of the curve trying to do things well, really taking on these issues and trying to take and embracing these laws to try to make something happen. And I don't know how to tell you how to do this, but one of my basic messages is you've got SB 100 and you've got the housing needs analysis, and I think you've got to find an elegant way to mesh them so that you actually get the outcomes that you want. I think it's also true that you have to remember that, and public policy often forgets this, that the housing market is not binary. There's not only people who can pay $800,000 for a house and people who make $10 an hour. And housing policy sometimes divides the market into those two. And there's a gigantic group of people in between, most of whom are native Oregonians, who cannot afford one and don't qualify for the other. And so I think that is a public policy gap that needs to be filled in some way. And the last thing I would say is, and I'm an urban planner, right? So I was trained in urban planning. I was trained to plan. But one of the things I've learned over the course of my career is that in the end, it's not really about the plan. It's about the outcome. It's about what happens on the ground. And your goal here is not to plan, even though the housing needs analysis is about to require you to do a lot more planning. Your goal is building enough housing at the right price point for the right people and preserving farm and forest land. That's your goal. Those are your goals. Those are probably the two most important goals out of the 19. The one has been in place for 50 years, and you've done a good job of it. The other is a problem that has emerged in the meantime, maybe partly because of SB 100, maybe not, but it has to be addressed. So that's what I would say. That's what I think Tom would do today. And I just want to say thanks for inviting me here. It's really great to be in Bend. I am a Californian who's not moving here. I hope you like me because of that. But I love visiting and I will visit on a regular basis. And I promise I will drop my money here and then go back to California. But thanks. Thanks very much. And I'll turn it back over and we're going to have our panel discussion now, right?
Feel free to take a seat. Thank you for that presentation. I know that I learned something from that today, so thank you very much for that. I just want to talk a little bit about the city's role in land use. So I work for the city of Bend as their land use communications coordinator. And the way that I like to describe it is basically land use is the invisible tapestry that weaves a city together. It's the reason why your neighborhood looks the way it does. It's the reason why your commute to school or work to the grocery store feels the way that it does. In Oregon, it is the reason why you can tell when one city ends and another city starts, with a clear break of rural homes, agriculture, and forest resources demarcating the journey between. While the core concepts of the Oregon land use system, like the urban growth boundary that we talked about, come from the state, the local community plays an integral role in informing how and where the city should develop. Over the last several years, the council has evaluated ways to adjust and update local rules to incentivize more housing and reduce barriers to development to reinvigorate areas of town like the core area. With estimates showing Bend's population is expected to grow by to 144,000. You can tell I wasn't a math major. By 2040, the city will continuously have to look at the relationship between our land use laws, the existing built environment, and accommodating growth. And if all of this has been interesting you today, and you come out of this being like, hey, I want to get more involved with land use and the planning of this, feel free to reach out to me or go to bendoregon.gov/neighborhoods because we have some volunteering opportunities within our neighborhood structure to be involved with the land use process and to help be directly involved in those decisions. So if that's something that interests you, let me know. I'll be around after the forum. And without further ado, let's introduce our panelists to discuss the future of land use here in Oregon. We already know Bill. Thank you for being here today, Bill. We have Ben Gordon, and you can come up or not come up whenever you see fit. He's the executive director of Central Oregon LandWatch. Prior to joining LandWatch, Ben worked throughout Oregon's environmental nonprofit ecosystem. He taught forest ecology for the Opal Creek Ancient Forest Center, served as a community organizer for the Oregon League of Conservation Voters and 1000 Friends of Oregon, then as program director for the Oregon Natural Desert Association. Then conducted frog research for New Zealand's Department of Conservation, hiked the Pacific Crest Trail, and earned his bachelor's degree in anthropology from the University of Colorado Boulder. So let's give him a round of applause. And then our third panelist is Dave Honnicutt. Dave Honnicutt is the president of Oregon Property Owners Association. For nearly 25 years, Dave has represented Oregon property owners in the Capitol and in courts throughout Oregon. As a registered Oregon lobbyist, Dave has successfully advocated for the passage of legislation to protect Oregon property owners in all areas of real property law, including land use, zoning, environmental law, eminent domain law, resolving government-private title disputes, and natural resources law. Dave received his Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Oregon and his Juris Doctorate from the Northwestern School of Law at Lewis and Clark College. A frequent speaker at legal, legislative, and planning seminars, Dave has lectured on real property law at numerous legal and educational seminars at colleges and universities across the United States and in various state legislatures throughout the country. So let's give him a round of applause too. Let the fun begin. I on now? Do I have to use my theater voice? Or am I good? I'm good now? Okay. Lucky for you, I don't have to use my theater voice. Okay. First question. Let's start with, what have the land use system's strengths and shortcomings been during this time? I think Bill teed that up pretty good in presentation. So I'll love to hear the thoughts of you two on that question.
Do I have to use my theater voice? Would you care to go? Okay.
Yep.
So we're 50 years in with our pioneering visionary land use planning system. Take a step back, as Bill mentioned, something that the land use system has been very effective at is preserving our farm and forest land. So the 20 years before we had the land use system, our state developed 3.5 million acres of farmland. Since then, we've had it for 50 years. We've developed only 2 million acres. Now, what does that amount to in terms of how we experience this place? I think Bill did a great job to describe a priority for siting our needed housing within our cities and towns to preserve our farm and forest land. Now, for Oregonians, farms and forests back in the 70s were very much the economic driver for our state. They're still critically important today. So we're able to retain that farmland that, if that is your livelihood, it supports. But at the same time, for each of us, and taking a step back and asking this question, and maybe a show of hands might be helpful. How many people in this room moved to Oregon from somewhere else? I'll start it. Okay. It's fascinating, right? I'm sure we all have our own reason for why we moved here. Why some other place, if we had the choice of where we were going to live, maybe didn't quite feel like home. We came to Oregon, something felt a little bit different. As was mentioned before by Brenna, the tapestry of what it means to experience Oregon today, infused by the land use system, thinking about 50 years, what drew us here when other places felt like they no longer or never felt like home. I think we can point to the intangibles that the land use system inspires, how we walk through every single day here in this state. That's something that over 50 years, even though our population has grown by more than double, we've retained a lot of the what it feels like to be in a city or town in Oregon. It has a small town feel. We haven't succumbed to the congestion pressures that a lot of the other places that adopted a sprawl model did. And so we've been able to hold on to farm and forest land, which is critically important, while building these imminently livable cities and towns. So that is, I think that on its face, that is the real strength, kind of the ethos of why Oregonians rallied in 1973 to create the land use system. Now, to get to the other side, obviously, Bill pointed out, we have an affordable housing dilemma, if not a crisis here in Oregon, that while it's not unique to Oregon, we're seeing it all over the nation. We do feel it most acutely now. For perspective, when I moved here, I was 24 years old. I got a job as a ski instructor. I actually made $11.50 an hour. I was able to rent a house with my then girlfriend, now wife. Those opportunities are not here today. And I wouldn't say it's a shortcoming of the land use system. And granted, I am an advocate for the land use system, but more in the implementation. So while we have goals 10 and 14, as Bill mentioned before, where the state is basically expecting the cities to come up with a housing strategy that accommodates growth across the spectrum of need. And then we've got cities that are expected to commit to doing that as quickly as possible. There are obviously some bottlenecks. So whether that's the land use system or other extemporaneous factors, which Bill alluded to, I think we have a commitment today, as our governor just upped our expectations, that we develop 36,000 home starts per year so that we can get ahead of this. Some of that obviously came as a result of what happened during our Zoom times in the pandemic. A lot of folks found Bend with convenient access to nature, quaint cities and towns, a place that they would prefer to be over where they were in a position to afford it. So prices have gone up. Now we have to address the demand in some way. I think our system is set up well to accommodate it. There is a sense of urgency. And as we move through that, we have to make sure that we're thoughtfully thinking about, well, if we solve this problem, what are the unintended consequences as we look to today and into the future? I think our system sets us up nicely for that. But there are a lot of other factors outside of the land use system that also have to come together for us to be able to do this well. But I think we are positioned to take it on. And I expect that all of the housing starts, it's only a matter of time before we make real progress there too. And we've been able to hold on to our farms and our forests, and that quality of life sensibility that we all experience here in Oregon.
It's on. Okay. I'll speak from the perspective of a native Oregonian. I really appreciated what Bill said. I think I think I've said everything that he said in his presentation. One of the interesting parts of Tom McCall was his visit but don't stay speech. I have found over the last 30 years that the most ardent advocates for Oregon's land use planning system are the people who completely ignored that directive from the governor. What we have done well, I agree with both Ben and Bill that we have done a good job of farmland protection. But there's a caveat to that, and I think Deschutes County is a poster child for that caveat. We have managed in this state to shoehorn our essentially all of our growth inside of our urban growth boundaries onto about 1% of the state's land mass. And so we have significant areas outside the boundary that we zone for agricultural land that have never been farmed and never will be farmed because no farmer is dumb enough to go out and fertilize a rock, pour water on a rock and love a rock and end up at the end of the growing season with a cold, wet rock, well-fertilized rock. And so we sort of got off the rails, and this had nothing to do with Tom McCall. We sort of got off the rails in 1975 on the definition of ag land by making it so broad that we didn't just protect what everyone in this room would consider to be truly agricultural land, but we also managed to protect and hence overregulate significant areas that aren't farmland. We call them farmland, but they're farmland in name only. So we sort of hit both sides of the farmland protection. We've done a very good job with goal 1, which is our citizen involvement goal. People can come in at any point in the process, and it's easy to get into the record at a legislative matter where we're talking about changes to the comprehensive plan or local land use regulations that apply citywide, or to an individual application. So we've done a good job of that too, of encouraging citizen involvement in the land use planning process. But the downside to that is that's also been essentially an open call to every person who bought the last lot in the subdivision and sees the neighbor building the exact same development that they just bought a house in, to go around to the neighbors and form the friends of, I already live here and I don't want anybody else to move in after me, and torture the hell out of a developer who's just trying, and a builder who are just trying to build according to the terms of the city's comprehensive plan and land use regulations. Time is money in the development industry. And we've created a system where you can essentially go from the local government process 2 or 3 steps into the local government process, up to the Land Use Board of Appeals, up to the Court of Appeals, up to the Supreme Court, and hopefully not down the ladder and back on a remand. And so we've struggled with that. We haven't focused much on economic development, goals 9 and 10. We're doing work on goal 10, housing now, and I thank the governor for essentially leading the charge on that. We haven't done much as far as developing a workable exceptions process. We have situations in the state, and I encounter them all the time. They used to call them Honnicutt's little old widows. But we have situations in the state where you've got the square peg and the round hole. If we had a variance process or a way that the local governments could deal with those square pegs in the round hole, we'd be better off. But unfortunately, since we've done so much of our work at the state level, Bill talked about a top-down system. That's what we have here. Since we've done so much of our work at the state level, the variance process happens to be at the Marble Nut House in Salem with 60 representatives and 30 state senators, hardly any of whom know anything about land use planning. And I can't tell you the number of times I've had legislators say, why do we need a bill for this? because you guys are the ones that created the problem with the statute that you passed. And so we need to do a better job of that. Endless process. I think Bill talked about that as well. It was one of the last of his 5 things to look at. Endless process delays is another situation. And we're taking a look at that as well. But we've had some shortcomings. We definitely, however, have done a good job of protecting farm and forest land and other rural land that ain't farm and forest land.
Thank you. I think this discussion tees up the next question pretty well of, how do we accommodate needed housing with our natural resources? If this is the problem we're facing, what do you all think we should be doing? Let's start with Bill.
I should, for context, I should mention something I don't think was mentioned in my introduction, which is that I lived for 25 years in Ventura County, California, which has voter-imposed urban growth boundaries. And I was the mayor of one of the cities in that county. And there were 2 things that emerged, I think, over a long period of time of having urban growth boundaries in that county. One was the suburban developers got driven off and the infill developers came in from LA. They realized that the situation had changed, and that was a good thing. But the other thing was that it turned out to be very difficult to accommodate all the development needed inside those growth boundaries. And so what you've seen in California, and you've seen it in Oregon too, is the realization that you can't freeze dry 3/4 of the land with single family zoning and also put in urban growth boundaries or other restrictions and expect to meet all housing demand. So I think, I'm trying to remember the name of your bill, of your law, that the number of your law that accommodate, that it does away with single family zoning.
That's
2001. Yes, thank you. 2001. I get the year and the name bill mixed up. You've seen that in several other states and locations. I think that will have a marginal effect because it will create a market, as it did in California, as it has elsewhere, for accessory dwelling units. And that will help some. But what I would say is make it easy to build what you want built where you want built it, and make it hard to build what you don't want where you don't want it. But don't make it hard to build what you do want where you want it, right? And I think Dave was indicating that that does happen a lot in Oregon. It happens in all over the country. That's not unique. But once you decide that you want development in a particular location, then you've got to actually allow it.
Thank you. So you all have 2 pieces of information at your table settings from Central Oregon LandWatch. One of them is a memo that my colleague who's in the back, Corey Harlan, led the charge on putting together. I think it does a really good job of giving you an example of right here in Bend. We have a land use system. It commits to providing a 20-year supply of developable land within that urban growth boundary for our city. We've had our urban growth boundary expansion approved for more than 7 years. And during that time, in particular, the expansion areas have been largely undeveloped. So we have to ask questions about, well, if it isn't, in this case, land supply, then what is it? What is standing in the way? So seemingly we have the tools, but the development isn't happening. We know for a fact there are thousands of apartment units approved to go in the city of Bend, and yet those aren't yet being built. So again, it begs the question of what stands in the way. I think Bill's slide did a good job to elucidate that there are a lot of factors that kind of come together in this concomitant that says conditions have to be just right for developers to feel inspired to take on their projects. Right now, we know, well, the cost of housing is very high. So too is the cost of labor, building materials. We've heard the process. So at LandWatch, we held a small developers roundtable discussion for developers who want to build infill projects. And we asked them, what stands in the way? Is it the land use system? What is it? And so what we hear is, no, it's not the land use system. We see how we're approved to build the things that we want to build. We have the ground to do it. It's been urbanized. However, it is all of these other factors. So as I mentioned, you've got this general sensibility of a market that's in flux. Developers are weary of jumping in and doing projects, wondering, will the rents hold? Can I make the expense of building this project pencil? So there's some amount of inspiring the development to occur on the land that we already have that needs to happen. And I think about that, and I ask myself, what are those incentives that developers need to feel confident that their pro formas will pencil, that they are in fact willing to take the risk up front to build the type of housing that we need? The other side of it, obviously, is the government intervention. Are there ways in which, as a society, if we do prioritize workforce, middle, affordable housing as our priority, we have financial resources as a state that we could decide to put towards incentivizing that type of development if that's what we really decide we want as a society. So with the land use system as our backbone and a commitment to ensuring we have the land supply, a second one with the expectation that we provide the spectrum of housing that is needed to meet the needs of our community members, what stands in the way? I think we know what we have to do. And if we really believe in this, we have to put our money where our mouth is and make these projects happen. We have to help our developers to feel supported, that they should take the risk on the front end, because this is what is both good for our community and good for business.
I've been in the enviable position this session, which is relatively new for me, of being able to say yes to just about everything. When the governor came out and said we need 36,000 units a year, and the industry is building about half of that, that indicates that we need to change something in order to make that happen. And on Bill's slide that had 5 different factors that lead to the underproduction of housing, the 2 that we can control at the state or local level are process and land supply. And so we have been saying for quite some time, this crisis isn't something that just jumped up in 2022. We've known about it for quite some time, and the development side has been screaming from the hilltops about it for quite some time. Our folks are saying that the 2 issues that we can actually address locally and at the legislative level are process and land supply. So we've been in the position of saying this session, infill, of course, yeah, we support that. Infrastructure, absolutely, we support that. Land supply, yes, we support that. And the answer really from our perspective is all of those things. When you go out and you look at the urban growth boundary, and I'll use the Portland metropolitan area as an example because I know those prices better. When you go out to Beaverton and you see 2 identical pieces of property just across the road from each other, one inside the urban growth boundary and the other outside the urban growth boundary, in a rural reserve designation, meaning it can't be developed or brought into the boundary for the next 50 years. And that land that's inside the urban growth boundary is selling for $800,000 an acre before you do anything with it, when you get your entitlements or anything. And the land outside the boundary, right across the road, same exact land, sells for $20,000 an acre. It gives you an indication that the boundary and its supply and demand, that the price for land is basically making it impossible for us to build the kind of product that the public wants and needs. We're agnostic on the policy. This is really just a question of math. The reason that the lots don't get developed is because if there's a market for it, they will get developed. But when you pay $800,000 an acre and $50,000 a unit in system development charges charged by the various special districts and local governments for the privilege of providing a product that the public wants, it makes it impossible to deliver houses at a price that the public can afford. And that's a problem for us. And I think it's a problem for all of us, not just for the development side. It's a problem for all of us that we need to address. And so, we have spent the entire session trying to help the governor meet her target of 36,000 units a year. And we're doing that in both with process and land supply, because those are the things that the legislature can control.
I want to go a little off script because this conversation kind of inspired a new question for me. We are talking a lot about the land use and development of like homes and businesses and things, but as you've alluded to, infrastructure for like, you know, roads and sewer and utilities, that's a huge part of actually making that happen. And as you alluded to, for those in the room who aren't steeped in government acronyms, SDCs are system development charges, which help fund the creation of those necessary utilities and everything that make development happen. And I would be curious to hear from you all about your thoughts on, you know, what solutions or ideas you have in terms of addressing that piece of that barrier that we see when it comes to the development of housing and other needed uses, because that is such a critical part. Any ideas from the think tank?
I'll just point out one difference, which is that the further out you want to build, the further from the city's core, the further from the existing infrastructure, the greater the expense to get into new projects that are kind of outside of where the city has been built. So while building within the city, certainly there are hookup and expenses to tie into the existing grid. They are far less expensive than when you are building something from scratch that is outside a good distance from where infrastructure ends.
And all I would say to that, and Ben and I can go out in the parking lot and have a fist fight afterwards, is that I completely disagree with that. When developing infill and moving up inside in existing developed areas, the infrastructure costs are often higher, and because you have to retrofit existing infrastructure. It's actually cheaper. And I'm sure I'll offend people by saying this. It's actually cheaper to go out on flat farmland and run infrastructure than it is to try and retrofit and build up, where you end up with where you move away from the residential building code and into the commercial building code than it is to do the other way. Having said that, SDCs are absolutely necessary. We've never argued that they aren't. Somebody has to pay for the infrastructure in order to allow the development to occur. And as long as we have people moving into the community, then we're going to have to figure it out. The federal government used to pay for infrastructure, but they don't anymore. And so the question is, whose ox are we going to gore? And right now the ox that gets gored is on the development side, but really in the end it's on you, because we're going to pass those costs on to the end purchaser. Contrary to belief, developers aren't raking in the dough. The industry average is about a 5 to 6% profit margin on a unit that's built. And so there's not a whole lot of wiggle room that you can go, and every dollar that gets added to the cost of the project makes it less likely that the project gets built. And instead of having, say, 40 units as opposed to 80, because the project pencils going out, you end up with 0. And so I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that, other than saying I would anticipate that if the public is serious about accommodating growth and helping folks at all price ranges, then the public, i.e. taxpayers, i.e. all of us, are ultimately going to have to help to pay for the infrastructure costs.
Any thoughts, Bill?
I would just say more broadly, one of the things that's happened in the last 50 years since all of these land use laws were passed, and also since a lot of, in many states, property tax reform or limitations was passed, the most obvious of which being Prop 13, a philosophy has emerged that can be summarized as growth must pay for itself. And if growth has to pay for itself, then as Dave says, that does add cost. And so I think there's a debate to be had about who really bears this cost. Dave is quite right that at the time that the land use law was passed, partly because of all those environmental laws that Nixon signed, the federal government was paying for every water treatment plant in the country, right? Which is never going to happen again. So I think there's a debate to be had about how to accommodate who really should bear that cost. Should that be entirely borne by new development? And if it is, then you deal with the consequence of probably higher home prices. Should that cost be borne partly by local taxpayers? Should they subsidize new development in their community? Should that be borne by the state? I think that's a debate that has to be had. I think the answer is probably all of the above, but that's not an overt debate that usually occurs. Usually what happens is local governments pile as much SDCs or whatever they are called in their particular state, often impact fees, onto the development as they can politically afford to do.
Well, and Bill, you make a good point. One of my favorite local planners, quietly and without attribution, told me one time, I don't know why we designed Disneyland when the Enchanted Forest will do. And I don't mean to offend anybody who likes the Enchanted Forest. I like it just fine. The point is, we all want lighted turf fields. We all want swimming pools. We all want the parks with, top of the line parks. The public wants all of those things. The question is, should we expect the development side to pay for all of the things that the public wants and essentially foist those costs onto the backs of the people that are trying to become first-time home buyers? That's the issue.
Yeah, that's very well said. I think to reiterate what has already been said, importantly, as a remark I made earlier, is as a society, we have to decide what we want and what we're willing to pay for, and what is the role of the everyday private citizen and government in making that happen.
So there won't be a fist fight in the parking lot about that.
There won't be a fist fight in the parking lot about
We're
anything,
gonna
Bill.
hold hands and stare into
Yeah.
each other's eyes. It'll be fine.
Let's close out with thinking ahead. What kind of changes, if any, would you all like to see looking forward to the next 50 years for the Oregon land use system?
Well, I'm hesitant to say what I think should happen being an outsider. Usually what I do is I come in and I give a keynote speech and I tell you what you should do. And then I go to the airport. And then you have to deal with what I said. So I'm a little reluctant, but as I said, and I wish I could be more specific about this, I do think a more simple, elegant system rather than a system where you're piling more complicated things on top of one another would be preferable. That is what has happened in California, and it has been unsuccessful. I wish I could be more specific, but that's my best thought at the moment.
I think we've touched on it a lot already, that the system has been an incredible backbone and tapestry for helping us to shape an Oregon society that is deeply connected to our natural environment, that also establishes the types of cities and towns that are compact, walkable, vibrant, all of those things. I hope that we continue to do. Obviously, with the housing crisis we're in, there's a sense of urgency that we expedite our efforts to address the housing remedies that we so desperately need. But at the same time, over the last 50 years, our population has more than doubled. And yet what it feels like to experience living in places like Central Oregon has not been negatively impacted exponentially like our growth. And so over the next 50 years, how do we continue to strike that balance, those intangibles, when we get up in the morning here in Central Oregon and say, man, it is a beautiful place to live. All of the things that meet that list of, well, what makes that so? Or I can't wait to get outside and do X because it is convenient, because the quality of that experience is very high. Even if it's walking to a coffee shop, seeing a smiling neighbor on the street, that we hold on to all of that. But I think we do have the tools, recognizing that we have some real challenges ahead of us with the land use system as our backbone. I believe that we can meet them. And my hope is 50 years from now, we continue to wake up feeling the same way we do today about Central Oregon.
I would say just a few things would make a significant difference. The first thing that I think we need to do is reduce process. I'll say it, goal 1 is broken. If you want to develop residential development in a residential zone, it should be quick, predictable, and easy. It should not be subject to a system that encourages NIMBYism, and that's what our goal 1 does. And we need to fix that, and we need to fix it quickly. We need a realistic exceptions process. We can't keep relying on the state legislature, who has more important things to do than resolve a pissing match between that came out of Lane County. And I have a bill that does that this session. We need a better process so that they aren't tasked with doing so. And so that frankly, you make my job more difficult by taking away my poster children. And if there's a way that we can do that, I would support that 1,000%, because there's a lot of good people that really just it doesn't fit very well for them. Local or state, we have a system where we have both local process and state process, and it's a hybrid. As Bill said, it really is dictated at the state level down. But as I've aged, I've gotten to the point where I'm almost, and I said this in the Source article a couple of weeks ago, if any of you read it, Ben and I were in that article. We need to pick one. It's gotten to the point where it's even inside the boundary in residential zoning, it's too difficult to develop, because we have varying criteria at multiple levels at both the state with statutes and administrative rules and goals, and at the local level with comp plans and land development codes. I'm at the point where I've vacillated between advocating for a statewide development code that applies in Bend and Roseburg and Duffer and Lakeview. And by the way, if somebody wants to come into Lakeview and do a 20-lot subdivision, rather than torturing them and making them do 3 backflips and eat a bug to get their land use approvals, we ought to have a freaking party. We need to encourage development in our smaller communities, in our Eastern Oregon and Southern Oregon and coastal communities. And so whether you do that top down at the state, or whether we give those local governments more flexibility and encouragement, pick one. And we just haven't done a very good job of picking one. If we can, last thing, and then I'll shut up, I promise. We need to put some teeth in goal 9 and 10. Goal 9 is the economic development goal. Goal 10 is the housing goal. We are putting teeth in goal 10 with this year's version of House Bill 2001. A lot of our big land use bills have been House Bill 2001. That's the speaker gets the first 10 bills. Tina Kotek's House Bill 2001 in 2019 was the bill that Bill was talking about, that allowed duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters in residential, in single family zones. This year's 2001 is called the ONA bill. Bill also mentioned that, Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Bill. It actually puts some teeth into goal 10 and gives the state some ability to override local and essentially force local communities to develop and meet their housing targets. We're doing okay on that. We need to do a better job.
Thank you so much, you guys. And you made it just right on time. So appreciate that. I think it's time for us to move into our Q&A. You have instructions on how to submit questions via Menti on your table. It looks like we already have some, so we'll just get started. All right. T. Let's start with, how is water considered in land use decisions?
Is this the part when we go out into the parking lot? No. Usually, what do they say? Whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting. Well, it really depends what type of land use you're talking about, because our cities are on municipal water, and outside of the cities, we're talking about groundwater versus surface water, exempt wells and the like. So I think it is quite varied. Obviously, you've got to have a proven amount of water to be able to develop on one side or the other of the urban and rural tapestry.
And let's talk about, and Ben's right on that. Let's talk about a different type of water that is a significant problem in the coast and the Willamette Valley. We have competing objectives in this state with our wetlands provisions in Chapter 195 that are managed and controlled by the Department of State Lands, DSL, our wetlands agency, and our land use planning system, which is regulated and governed by the Land Conservation and Development Commission and their working staff, the Department of Land Conservation and Development. There are cities in the Willamette Valley and on the coast that have buildable land inventories. Those are the areas of land that are available for development inside their urban growth boundaries that were done quite some time ago in the 80s or 90s. And these are typically small cities that are growing at a slower pace than the Bends of the world. In these areas, what we've discovered as DSL has run out their statewide wetlands inventory and started to map the areas in the valley and on the coast for hydric soils, which is the primary wetland indicator. Most of these communities have significant portions of their buildable land inventory that the department that DSL considers wetland. When you do that and you have to mitigate in order to address the wetlands issues that DSL has placed on the property, you make the cost of housing, you raise the cost of housing to the point that the projects don't pencil. So again, this is a conflict, a different type of water conflict, but one that really needs to be resolved between two different agencies, where you have one agency saying we've got to protect wetlands and the other agency saying we can't build outside of our urban growth boundaries, and the cities saying, well, what are we supposed to do? And no one really has a good answer. I think we may be able to get an answer to that now. We have a better chance of addressing that now. And I know that the Governor's Housing Production Council is taking a look at that issue. Not a Bend problem, but certainly a problem in the valley and on the coast.
I don't know anything about the situation here. I would just say in other parts of the West, by the way, you might have read recently that the state of Arizona basically has now shut down well-based residential development. You can still build on the municipal systems. What I see emerging, there have been a million different ways to try to solve this problem. In Southern California, one way has been for the cities to buy water from the farmers, and the farmers then use the water to put in drip irrigation, right? To create more efficiencies indirectly in the agriculture system to free up water for urban use. The other thing I see emerging, particularly in Southern California, is, and this is kind of out there and it's going to take a while and it's expensive, is to recycle the water toilet to tap within the system that you already have. So you're constantly recycling the water you're using over and over and over again within your local system. So you don't have to worry so much about depleted groundwater or capturing water from rivers or whatever. You've got a system that has water in it. It's expensive. It takes a long time to build, but you can then just start to recirculate that water. One of the things I realized when I've lived in San Diego twice now is that getting water from the Colorado River or Northern California to San Diego and then flushing it out into the ocean and then waiting for it to absorb up into the atmosphere again and then have it snow. hundreds of miles away is a pretty inefficient recycling system. Whereas if you can do that locally, it becomes more efficient.
Do you think our current transportation investments and design of them are consistent with, I believe that's our goals of building complete communities and infill housing?
Specific to Bend, it sounds like.
It's giving that energy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think Ben did a great job to thoroughly develop a transportation systems plan that really thought about how we were going to grow here. The projects that we're seeing come out of the ground now are really a reflection of how do we provide some of the infrastructure that had been missing in the spirit of complete communities. And for folks who aren't as familiar with what complete communities are, it's effectively kind of everything you need is within, we'll say, the 15-minute neighborhood example. So where you live, where you work, where you play, your access to the services that you depend on, and how you get around, all of that is sort of a neighborhood campus that all can be reached conveniently, safely, whether you walk, bike, roll, within a pretty quick duration. So is the work that's coming out of our current SDC to improve our transportation infrastructure moving us in that direction? I would say yes.
What state or jurisdiction, domestically or internationally, is the current poster child for land use, affordable housing, environmental protection? So basically, like, is there anyone doing it right?
Well, of course not. That's a good question. I think the answer to that question is that different places have done different things well. I think Maryland, although the recent governor abandoned this system, did a good job conceptually. And again, going back to being simple and elegant, this was a long time ago, Governor Glendening, who I used to work for at Smart Growth America. He designated priority growth areas and priority conservation areas. He put the state infrastructure money into the growth areas, the state conservation money into the conservation areas. What that did was, among other things, that reversed the ratio between the amount of land being developed and the amount of land being conserved. And it also created more compact communities. I think that aspect of that was really good. I also think that the way Washington State implemented the Growth Management Act with the Puget Sound Regional Council in the Puget Sound area was quite effective. Basically, what they said was, and this is not as relevant to Bend as it would be, say, to Portland, is because Seattle is a very large metropolitan area, but they came up with a very simple goal, which was along the I-5 corridor and the associated light rail line, which is almost follows I-5. That's where 20% of the jobs in the region were, but only 3% of the housing. And the goal was to flip it around so that 20% of the housing was there and as much as possible revolved around the light rail stations. So I think there are different aspects of this from different states that Oregon can learn from. I also think probably Oregon has, as Ben has said, Oregon has been the leader in protecting farm and forest land. California has also been a leader in that, but they've done it in a real weird, unusual, intricate, complicated California kind of a way that's probably not worth trying to replicate. But the idea of putting state money in the right place and having targets, jobs, housing targets, so that those are in close relationship to one another, as Ben said about Bend. I'm getting Ben and Bend confused. I'm sorry.
I'm often called Bend. I get emails, dear Bend.
Yeah. So I think there are aspects of this from other states, but I don't think any, and I think Florida wound up being a disaster for a variety of reasons. But I, and not just recently, but I think there are aspects from other states that are very useful to know about and learn from. But I don't think there's any one state that has magically solved the problem.
This is a very relevant one. been lifted parking requirements recently, like other jurisdictions. What impact does that have on land use and development?
Well, the theory is that it lowers the price, the cost of development, right? By reducing the amount of parking, not eliminating it, but reducing it to whatever the market wants. The market being whatever the developers can talk the lenders into accepting, I think, right? So it's not zero, but the theory would be that it does reduce the overall cost of development. That and many jurisdictions around the country are now lifting parking requirements on that theory. I used to live immediately adjacent to downtown Houston. Interestingly enough, downtown Houston had no required parking in the downtown area, and yet you've never seen more parking garages anywhere because the lenders simply didn't believe that everybody wouldn't drive to the office downtown.
I think that's well said. Obviously this happened recently in Bend, and having a pulse in the community the way that I do, I heard from a lot of people. One of the examples was, now all these people are going to park in front of my house. And if you play that one out, the existing development of homes and businesses with its current street side parking and driveways and other accommodations for cars, that doesn't change unless that block of town gets redeveloped in some way. So really the implications are for future developments. And I think within a developer's pro forma, they want to make sure that the project succeeds. Some of this suggests we need to make sure that our public transportation infrastructure, which while it has gotten much better in my 17 years in Bend, still there's a lot of work to do. Places like I think Seattle, that started in on removing parking minimums, prioritizing places that were along their light rail, where they kind of linked up. There's going to be less parking, but there's the convenience of having public transit right out your door. I like those concepts. So as Ben starts to get into the how we implement it, some of the fears I think are overblown, that everywhere all the time you're never going to be able to park your car in front of your house. But I think it is on the developers to come and the developments to come to figure out, you want to have a product that sells. So how do you accommodate both having more land to work with? Hopefully that gets passed on to folks who need that savings the most. Obviously we all do these days, but how does that result in a more efficient use of our urban land, while also facilitating still the ease and convenience of, if you're someone who has a car and wants to park it, you still can. So I don't think it's one or the other.
Yeah, and I think Ben hit the nail on the head. It really is on the development side, just a question of will a project pencil doing that? Everybody likes to say we want walkable, bikeable communities, and we like walkable, bikeable communities as well. But the real question is, okay, if I build a walkable, bikeable community and I limit parking to the point that everybody who drives there and relies on their car and won't buy a unit in that development, then it just doesn't get built. I hate to sound like a broken record, but we have said all session long, we've been saying this for years, if you expect the development side to build the product, then you have to listen to the development side, because we'll build the projects that pencil, and if they won't, we won't. And so the number of people that talk about, I like mass transit, while they drive their car, while they get in their car and drive to their office every day, essentially meaning I like mass transit as long as the other cars and that are surrounding me use it. It's just an economics question for us.
Well, let me just add one thing. As a former student of the big parking guru Don Shoup, who has been the most famous advocate of paid parking, to the question of, are they going to park in front of your house? I do think that a comprehensive parking system in a district makes sense, where You pay for parking where demand is greater than supply. You possibly restrict the time limits in other locations. And another idea he has is in residential areas is, sure, let people park in, let people, if there's a high demand to park in front of your house, let people park there, but they have to pay. And then the revenue goes back to benefit your neighborhood. That's just an idea that he has thrown out there again and again.
And we have one of those in Bend, which we don't have enough time to get into, but next question is, now when UGB expansions are implemented, the lands brought in are large parcels. That only means a handful of property owners are in control of the land development. How do we address that monopoly?
Well, and actually, the way we have a prioritization statute for our boundary expansions in states, it's statutory. It's not done via administrative rule. And it's really inefficient because what it prioritizes is exception lands. In other words, lands that don't meet the definition of farm and forest land. And so what we have is the cities are directed when they expand their urban growth boundaries to look at what's typically rural residential, small acreage home sites. And for many people that own small acreage home sites, their land is more valuable as a small acreage home site than it would be to sell to a builder to essentially doze the house and build an urban level of development on that property. And so one of the things that we have tried to change over the years is changing that prioritization statute away from a focus on farm and forest protection and towards where is it easiest to build to run the infrastructure. Because unfortunately that's going to get at the larger parcels, but those are the parcels, frankly, that both for the city and the residents of the city and the incoming residents and on the development side are the easiest ones to develop at a cheaper cost than trying to develop in exception areas.
I like your point, Dave. I think it's a good one. There's another way of looking at it for folks who are familiar with urban reserves. So the urban growth boundary is a 20-year supply of developable land. And an urban reserve, if the city chooses to undertake one, is a 50-year supply. Now, the same is true of an urban reserves process as a UGB process when the two are separate. So you do have a prioritization. You do have to first look to your rural residential and that type of zoning. But when they come in through an urban reserve, they've already sort of gone through the system, rural residential and EFU, so that when it comes time to add them to the urban growth boundary, there's no longer the prioritization. So they can be considered equally at that point. So you do it for a 50-year. And my feeling is there's no downside. I mean, there's the cost of staffing and having to go through the work of creating the urban reserve, but some of the issues that Dave has raised can be addressed through processes we already have. The second one, and I think this is germane to the question, which is that just because a piece of land is brought into an urban growth boundary, it doesn't mean that the owner of the property necessarily wants to sell it to a developer. So how do we inspire kind of connecting developers with property owners, helping them to see now that their land is urbanized? Well, a lot of property owners are salivating at the opportunity to see the cost per acre go skyrocketing up from when it was in some rural designation. But how do we kind of marry the two so that as properties come in, there is an understanding of how the process will work to annex the land, now that it's urbanized, connect to a developer, that kind of stuff. I don't have an answer, but I recognize that seems to be one of the bottlenecks, especially if a large parcel owner, property that's in the UGB, isn't of a mind to sell it.
One thing that Ben and I can agree on, he mentioned urban reserves. I like urban reserves a lot as well. Unfortunately, there are only 13 cities in Oregon. The urban reserve statute has been in place since 2007, and only 13 cities have managed to designate reserves. It's very difficult, especially for a small city. And Oregon is a state composed predominantly of small cities. There are far fewer Bends than there are little, Adrians or Merrills. And so we need to make it easier for cities and provide incentives for cities to designate urban reserves. I'd be happy to work on that.
Anything you want to close out with, Bill?
Well, the only thing, I'm not quite sure where that question came from, that last question. I would simply say greenfield development, which is what development in a newly designated area is going to be, is usually going to be on large parcels. And there are economies of scale that can be beneficial to home buyers and renters. Overall, in conclusion, I would say that this is really an interesting and stimulating conversation to me. I've learned a lot about Oregon. I realize it's a very intricate world that you guys operate in because of the nature of the system. But I would encourage you, and I'd be happy to help you understand what lessons can be brought from other places that can be brought to bear on Oregon generally, and Central Oregon in particular.
All right, that's our show, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Bill, Ben, Dave, and Brenna for leading us in conversation today. And thank you to our planning committee, Amy Sabadini, Kathy Sabatier, Heather Martin, and Daisy Lehman for putting together today's forum. If you've been inspired to continue this discussion, Building a Better Bend has done a 3-part series. You can see their first 2 parts on their website, and then in September, they have a 3rd part to that series. And then we'll be taking a break in July from forums and returning to the River House on August 17th at 11:30 for a forum about discipline in our schools. If you are a City Club member, we are currently seeking help on our membership and marketing committees. And if you're not a member, please consider joining. There will be information sent to you following today's forum. This organization only exists through the support of the community, our sponsors, and our members. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and have a great day.